Okay. My name is Edgar Aftergood. In Europe, prior to World War II, it used to be Aftergut, G-U-T. I was born in Berlin, Germany, in 1923, and I lived in Berlin until 1934, and even though I was very young, I remember the day when Hitler came to power in 1933. My parents were in very modest circumstances in Berlin, but I had lots of friends, and I went to school, and I studied music as a very young person. And I do remember in the early 30s, on occasion, I would get beaten up in school. Not seriously, I want to add. I would get beaten up just due to the fact that they knew that I was Jewish because I looked Jewish. And in 1934, my parents decided to go back to Poland, namely Warsaw, where they originally came from, because there was absolutely no way for my father to make a living in Germany. And this was not a happy decision at the time, because my mother had many memories from Poland from before, and she knew what an anti-Semitic country this always was. Nevertheless, we had no alternative, so my father, my mother, myself, and my sister Stephanie, we went back to Warsaw, and my mother had 3 sisters in Warsaw who were rather well established, and they helped us a lot in getting a place to live. And for myself and my sister started going to school, and so that was somewhat of a normal life. I, at the age of 11, had to learn Polish. I did not speak a single word of Polish, only German, which in itself was quite an undertaking, if you know what I mean, because it's so much different. And I rather enjoyed my personal situation in Warsaw. As I said, I went to school and I was doing well. I was also going to summer camp every year for about 8 weeks, and I met a lot of people and made many friendships. And it was difficult for us to believe that everything was going to change with the war starting in 1939. And we lived through the bombardment of Warsaw in 1939, and I saw lots of destruction, even though the apartment where we lived was not destroyed, but there were times that pieces of what we used to call shrapnel, which are parts of bombs, would get stuck in walls in our apartment. And so if anyone would have been standing there at a time, this would have been injury or death. But we survived that, and finally the Germans arrived in Warsaw and took over the city. And very soon after that, they started new laws. Some of them had to do with the Polish population, but most of them with Jews. Like, we had to start wearing armbands with a Jewish star. And I recall walking with my father on one of the main streets in Warsaw. It was late afternoon, and a German military person of some rank walked by, And as soon as he had passed us, he turned around and he said that you are supposed to take your hat off when you see a German officer. And he hit my father in the face, and then he hit me with the back of his hand. So for my father, who had been educated in German culture and who actually spoke German better than Polish, this was a tremendous shock, because he had now first-hand experience as to what might possibly happen. And this is one of the terrible first things that happened, that really we could see that what we had to look forward to. Early, after the Germans arrived, within a few months, I don't remember the exact date, they started building walls in Warsaw for the future Jewish ghetto. And at a certain point in time, an order came to, for all Jews who lived in certain neighborhoods to move out and move to within the walls of this new ghetto. So my mother's sister, Dr. Anna Braude-Heller, was a chief physician of a Jewish children's hospital in Warsaw. The hospital was called Szpital Baumanów i Bersonów, and it was on the street that was called Sienna in the city of Warsaw. She was able to get an apartment in a former school in Warsaw, where the hospital, the children's hospital, was going to be relocated. And this hospital in Warsaw, the new location, was at the corner of Leszno and Żelazna. And we moved together with her. It was for Warsaw, it was a rather large place, and we were able to manage to move over there. The children's hospital was in a very difficult situation, because lots of children were very, very ill and were brought into this hospital, and there was just not enough room, or there were not enough beds to accommodate all the children, and the children would have to just be lying in the hallways instead of being in the wards themselves. What I think is an interesting footnote is that on occasion, the very well-known personality, Dr. Janusz Korczak, used to show up at this hospital and used to try to get room for his children from his institution, which was the very now well-known orphanage in Warsaw, where he would try to get space. And when he would be told that, look, the best we can do is put these children on the floor, he would get very indignant about it, and of course rightly so. But the local managers of this hospital did not really see how they could get better conditions for one group of children at the expense of another. So I remember that this created quite a lot of friction. And of course, as we all know, he later on took his children and went to, I think it was Treblinka, to the extermination camp, which is all well known and written up. Conditions were getting very bad, and my mother's sister, my aunt, Dr. Anna Braude-Heller, was a very forceful person. She was a widow, and she had lost one of her children to illness, not in the ghetto, but prior to World War II. She was always extremely outspoken, and she had many really bad arguments with the German authorities because they simply would refuse to supply enough beds and enough medication and enough food for these children in a hospital. And unfortunately, it did get to the point in the Warsaw Ghetto, the way I remember it, where different institutions and different units, like the hospitals, the community center, would fight among themselves for supplies, and because it was strictly a matter of who would last the longest. And conditions in this children's hospital were such that every morning a big cart, a truck, would arrive in front of our windows, because like I explained, our apartment was actually part of that building, and they would unload between 50 or to 150 bodies straight into that truck, out of the hospital, just like a meat truck that you sometimes see. And that, of course, was a horrible sight. And I could tell, and I will never forget, the fact that these bodies were completely starved to death. I mean, they looked just so thin, you know, that it was just incredible. This was before any selections took place. I remember conversations where people would figure that if the same amount of people who were dying in the ghetto every day of so-called natural causes, I think that it would take maybe 10, 15 years before everybody would be dead without any further action being necessary. I believe it was July of 1942 when big signs, posters were posted all over the ghetto that the whole population is supposed to report in certain places in order to be shipped east to work camps and to better conditions, which supposedly existed there. And this is when the deportation started. In the beginning, we did not know where these people were going, but within several weeks, someone would actually come back from there and report that these people were being put to death. And of course, at that point, these trains went to Treblinka from Warsaw, as far as I know. Another thing I wanted to talk about is about life in the ghetto in Warsaw. It was extremely difficult to survive. It was more difficult for some, and a little bit easier for others. People who had means, people who had savings, or people who had some valuables would be selling them out little by little, usually to intermediaries who would take them over to the Polish side and sell them either to Poles or sometimes to Germans. As a matter of fact, there was a way of selling houses and real estate where people owned real estate on the Polish side. If they would sign off that they don't put any more claim to this property, and that it's legally sold to this person, Polish person, they would get a very small sum of money, which didn't really matter at the time how little they got, since this helped to maybe survive another month or another week. My situation in the Warsaw Ghetto was somewhat exceptional because I lived at the house in the hospital, at my aunt's apartment, and I had been studying music since before World War II, since I was a child, and there was some semblance of normal life in the ghetto, where people got together and secretly tried to study, to educate their children. That was only in some cases and only among certain people who were not that close to starvation yet. And I was able to go to a class where some of our teachers from prior to wartime, would meet in private apartments and would give us classes in several subjects in order to eventually get a high school degree, which incidentally, in my case, since I did survive, as soon as the war was over, I did get a full legal high school degree on the same paper with the same stamp and marks that was given to anyone who got a high school degree prior to World War II. And I still have this document today. And so we used to meet not always in the same place. And I met really some wonderful people there. I got close to know the teachers and also the students. There were two sets in this particular group where I went. Was organized by a school that was a Jewish school that was well known in Warsaw by the name of Spójnia. And several of the teachers were actually from that school. There were two sets of students, 10 in each group, and these were really outstanding students in most cases, because it took a lot of motivation to even think about studying under these circumstances. I'm sorry to say that out of these 20 young people, other than myself, there was only one other person who survived the war. And this other person was a grandson of Dr. Ludwig Zamenhof, the founder of Esperanto. And this young man, to the best of my knowledge, I have not been in touch with him since I'm in America, but I was in touch with him after World War II. His name was also Ludwig Zamenhof. And to the best of my knowledge, he is still in Poland, but under a different name. He changed his name. There was a, like in many other fields, there were some promoters in Warsaw, and I think the word promoter is right, who would try to make a living by organizing some cultural activities. And there was someone, knowing the love of the Jewish people for classical music, who suggested to form an orchestra and have some soloists and to organize some concerts where people would come on a Saturday noon and pay their admission fee. And there actually, an orchestra was created due to the fact that there were several really good musicians in the Warsaw Ghetto, former members of the Warsaw Opera and of the Philharmonic. I actually can only say that I don't remember many names, but I know that our concertmaster, the first violinist, was a man by the name of Holzmann, and he was an excellent musician. And another one, these were all people quite a bit older than myself. Another one was Levinson, a very fine violinist. Our conductor's name was Neuteich. I had seen a picture of him and his name mentioned in Yad Vashem. I do not know whether any of the other musicians are listed there by name. This is why I felt I'd like to mention these two that I remember. This orchestra was organized by a man who, by the name of Pullman, that's P-U-L-M-A-N, who was actually from Vienna and who got caught in Warsaw because he was visiting his sister and brother-in-law, a Dr. Bielenki, who was also a very well-known physician, and his wife, who was Mr. Pullman's sister. By coincidence, they lived in Warsaw in the same apartment house where we lived, Szpitalna 5, which means Hospital Street 5, and we lived on the second floor of this 5-story building, and they lived on the first floor, one floor below us. Of course, we all had to move when the ghetto was closed. They also had to move when the ghetto was closed, and this orchestra was organized. And I remember that Mrs. Bielenki was instrumental in trying to help these musicians in a material sense. Like she would provide, with great difficulty, food and sandwiches before rehearsals and certainly before the concerts, because otherwise these musicians would not have been able to even play. See? And a great number of concerts took place. If I say great, I would think that maybe 20 concerts took place. And I can only say as a fact that 2 of the concerts I played as a soloist, the Beethoven Violin Concerto, on 2 occasions as a soloist with this orchestra. And this is not because I was such a great violinist at the time, but this is because there was no one else. And so they needed someone to play it, and I did have the opportunity to do some practicing. And the reviews were mixed. Some people thought, under the circumstances, that I was pretty good, and some people didn't. I personally had my doubts just how good I was, but that, of course, is not the point here. At another concert, I played Bach's E major concerto for violin and orchestra, and Beethoven's Romanza in F major, Romanze in F-Dur. There were other musicians, some young musicians who played, a very outstanding young man, a violinist by the name of David Seidel, who did not survive. There was a young woman who studied in Warsaw, whom I remember from before the war, who was very talented. And her name was Kozibrudka, a most unusual name, Kozibrudka. There was a very fine pianist, a real close personal friend of mine, by the name of Richard Spira, and another fine pianist by the name of Kazimierz Gelernter. These were all people who were very close to me, and none of these people survived. As a footnote to these remarks, some of the concerts where I played as a soloist and also in the orchestra were attended by some high SS official who would come in and sit down in his gray silver uniform and listen to the whole concert and then get up and leave without making any trouble. Later, after we started these concerts, maybe a few months later, a new law came out by the German authority, whoever they were, that we could only play music by Jewish composers, which was not an easy task, but even that they somehow managed. This is when I learned that, for instance, Saint-Saëns was Jewish, which I had never known before. And of course Mendelssohn, who was a convert, was okay as far as the Germans were concerned. And then there were some other actually Jewish composers in Poland. And so that very much limited the possibilities. Now, next, all this, of course, ended when the deportation started. And I will not at this time go into it in depth, except I will say that at one point myself and my mother and my aunt had to go through a selection which took place at the Jewish community building. And since we were employed by the hospital, we were given cards which entitled us to remain. My father was not given a card at that time, so he had to disappear and hide. He could not go to the selection. And through some miracle, he managed to get through this dragnet, or whatever I would call it at this point. And he returned a few days later after the selection was over. My sister, Stephanie, went to a nursing school, a school of nursing that was at the hospital, not the children's hospital, but the general hospital in Warsaw for the general population. And she became ill and died within very few days of an illness that can be described as something very close to polio. When the selections were over, as it's well written up in many different books and documents, there were about between 50 and 60,000 Jews left in the Warsaw Ghetto, and at that time the ghetto was made even smaller than it had been, and we had to move again. And at that point they put the general hospital together with the children's hospital. And again, we managed to get a couple rooms for our immediate family together with my aunt. And the Germans would spread rumors to the effect that this was going to be it as far as any further action, because they intended to keep a Warsaw Ghetto to show the world that there is a Warsaw Ghetto. And not having any better choice, we wanted to believe that this was true. However, in January 1943, these special troops came again and took several thousand people one morning. So this was enough proof that the end of the Warsaw Ghetto was close. This is when rumors of self-defense ideas appeared, and my father decided that he would try to go out of the ghetto and see what the possibilities would be to hide until the war would be over, if it would be over, which we had no assurance. And my father went out in January and got in touch with his sister, who never moved into the ghetto. There were some cases of Jewish people who never did go into the ghetto, but remained on the Polish side as Poles. Some survived that way, and some did not. And one of the surprising things about the isolation of the ghetto was that until the last moment, the telephones between the ghetto and the outside worked very well. I also seen this already written up in some of the things I read about it. Yeah, they worked quite well, and my father was able to call from the Polish side over the wall to us and say that on a certain day I should come. And which I did. The procedure was actually quite simple, is I would go out with a group of workmen who would leave the ghetto every morning to work on railroads and would be brought back every night through the entrance into the ghetto to spend the night in the ghetto. I would leave with these people in the morning, and on the way back, late afternoon, I would detach myself from them, of course with the knowledge of the so-called leader of this group, who was paid off and who in turn would pay off the German policeman who had a paper, you know, if you leave with 40 and come back with 39, there must be a reason what happened, but as long as he would be paid off, there'd be no problem. And so I just walked away from this group, and I met my father at a certain place, and we moved in with his sister, who lived on the other side of Warsaw in Praga with her 2 daughters. And we stayed there about 4 or 5 months. And we fled this place when I started having very strong suspicion that we had been found out, that people in that building knew that there are Jews hiding out. And we fled, and a friend of my father's, a Pole whom he knew from his university days, gave him keys to an empty apartment in a completely different part of Warsaw to just go there and open up the place, and for us to stay there for a while and hide out, which we did. I'm sorry to say that my father's sister, my aunt, and her 2 daughters were taken by the German Gestapo 2 days after we departed this place in Praga. And of course they were executed within very few days. We stayed in this place in Warsaw about 2 weeks, and by that time we moved to a place in Warsaw called Żoliborz. This place had a reputation that it was just a little bit easier for Jewish people to hide out there. That in this particular place, this was a settlement, a new settlement. It was new in the 30s. were what was called at that time the labor movement in Poland, had some money and invested in some housing for low-income people. And I really don't know how true it was, but this is only hearsay as far as I'm concerned. These people were quite liberal and were not as quick to denounce Jews to the German authorities. And I know of some apartments that at times held 12 or 15 people in that area hiding out. And we were there for a while. And then for some money that my father had hidden, a Polish man, whom I remember very well, bought a single apartment for himself in a fairly new building, because the apartments in Poland before the war and after the war, you had to pay a price to get in before you could even start paying rent. So he bought this single apartment and in his name, which meant that if the war was ever over and if the building would not get bombed, this man would own the apartment, which he in fact did, because the building survived. And we stayed there, again, maybe 8 months in this small place. If I say we, that means my father and my mother's sister and myself. We stayed in that place, and it was quite, for us, was quite peaceful. We did not have any problem. The only problem we had when my father got a stroke one day after bringing a bag of groceries up the stairs. I believe this place was on the 4th floor. And he put down this bag of groceries and collapsed, lost his speech. And it was extremely difficult for us to get in touch with anybody to help us with some medication or with the doctor. But at one certain point, we even did get a doctor to come up there and to give him some injections. And he slowly got a little bit better, to the point that he regained his speech and he could limp along. I don't know whether I explained the fact that he was our only link with the outside world, because myself and my mother's sister looked extremely Jewish as far as Warsaw was concerned. And if I walked in Warsaw on the street, someone walking on the opposite side of the street and looking in my direction could point me out as a Jewish person, because that's the way it was in Poland always. So my father, however, looked like a Polish nobleman, and he cultivated a very large mustache, had gray hair, and he could be taken for an elderly Polish gentleman, and he was. And he went lots of places in Warsaw, traveled on a streetcar, walked, went to the stores, bought newspapers. I also should mention that while we were in this place, in this one-room apartment, which was, the neighborhood was called Bielany, which exists today, there was some help reaching us, which came indirectly from the United States. There was a certain amount of money trickling through to certain people in Warsaw. And a group of people who were, again, who had worked in this children's hospital, who were also hiding out in Warsaw, started receiving some money through the American Joint Distribution Committee, or also through an organization that still exists called Bund, the Jewish Bund, not the German Bund. And they somehow got the information where we were hiding, and there is a very fine person who just visited me a couple of weeks ago, who's living in New York City today, a Mrs. Bronisława Farman, who was, at that time, she was a very young woman with proper looks. In other words, she didn't look Jewish. And it was her job to go from one place to another and leave some paper dollars with people who had, even if they found a place to hide, they could not last because they have to buy groceries. And so at that time, she reached us, and she started coming around. And so my father would go out to the store, and first he would go and change this money, which was not difficult in Warsaw, because there were always people looking for dollars, even Germans. I mean, there was always a black market. And then he would buy some things, and this is how we survived outside of Warsaw. Then one day, a tremendous bombardment started out of nowhere, and I personally thought that this must be the Russians attacking Warsaw. And it turned out, no, it was not the Russians. These were Polish partisans who decided to take the city of Warsaw themselves from the Germans before the Russians would come and liberate them. In other words, they did not want to be liberated by the Russians, because these people were not only anti-Nazi and anti-German, they were also very much anti-Russian, because the past history of Poland is very tragic, and the Russians played a large part in occupying and mistreating Poles, and which is a well-known thing. So at that point, the Germans, of course, fought back and won the battle. It's a terrible thing that not only many Poles got killed, really for no good reason at that point, so close to the end of the war, but many Jews fought in that Battle of Warsaw, which was not a Jewish battle, really. And some of my friends from my class in the ghetto, which I described prior, where we were studying together. I should mention a young friend, extremely brilliant young man by the name of Milejkowski, fought and died in this Battle of Warsaw. So the Germans fought back and issued an order for the population of Warsaw. The ghetto did not exist anymore. The population of Warsaw to leave the city of Warsaw. So the Poles started walking out with little bundles and leaving the city. And the Germans started setting fire to house after house after house after house, systematically. And this is how the city of Warsaw was finally destroyed, with the exception of these buildings which were occupied by the Germans themselves. So under these circumstances, we also had to abandon our place. They said, alle raus, which means everybody out. But it was somewhat easier for us to get lost in the crowd, because now the Poles themselves became refugees, war refugees. By Poles, I mean the population of Warsaw became refugees. So we just walked out of Warsaw. Bielany, our last residence, was already on the outskirts of the city. So we walked out, and it was at this point extremely difficult, because my father could hardly walk, since he had had a stroke a few months before. So we walked very slowly. It took us several weeks to walk about 28 kilometers to a little village outside of Warsaw called Bornie. In the meantime, as far as resting at night, we just would rest in the woods or in the bushes or whatever there was on the roadside, but so did many other people. And when we arrived in Borneo, my father went to see the mayor of that particular town and explained to him that he's a refugee from Warsaw and that he needs shelter. And that mayor gave him a paper, an order for a peasant in a very small wieś or village, peasant village, to take in these 3 refugees and feed them. So with that order, we marched from Borneo to that little village called Gole, which is maybe 5 kilometers. Not much, but it was quite far for us to get there. And we got there one late afternoon, and these peasants looked over my father and said, okay, you can stay in the barn. And my father assured them that as far as feeding, they wouldn't have to worry because we would be able to buy whatever little we needed. So they felt better about that. They didn't have to feed us. And we lived there, in, of course, very primitive circumstances, but we got used to it, and at a certain point, after we had been there maybe 1 month, the German military arrived into that village with their trucks and their armor and occupied the whole number of, I shouldn't say houses, because these were huts, H-U-T. These were not houses. These were actually peasant huts out in the country. And they stayed there, and as a matter of fact, I remember that some peasants were not cooperating with them. In other words, were not giving them what they wanted, and they set some of the barns on fire. And they must have been there 5 weeks, and after 5 weeks, and they did not bother us at all. They did not bother us. And after 5 weeks, they moved out, but they left like a skeleton crew of Germans in that little town. And now in a house that was adjacent to our barn, a German paramedic moved in, not a doctor, a paramedic. And he had quite a nice personality. And he became friendly with my father. In the beginning, my father could only speak 1 or 2 words of German. But as they became more friendly, my father's German became better and better. And this paramedic started receiving peasants from outlying areas as patients because they needed medical help for themselves, for their children. And he sort of liked that. But since he could not talk to these peasants, he needed someone to translate for him. So my father became his translator. And these peasants would pay him not in money, but with merchandise, mostly with food, eggs, bread. And this paramedic would be very generous again with my father, and my father would get from him things, which helped us to survive. And this went on for quite some time, for a good number of months, until a very heavy winter, and if I'm not mistaken, it was January of 1945, when the Russian army, which incidentally we could hear the guns for several months. There were guns maybe several hundred kilometers away from where we were, but they just would not advance. But finally, they started out advancing, and these Germans took what they could. They took all the horses away from the peasants because they were not all motorized. And they started moving out. And I'm certain that they did not, all of them did not make it, because the Russians were close to Berlin before they could ever get out of Poland by, going with these peasant carts and horses and so forth. And one day the Russians entered that village with tanks. And in the beginning, they made a good impression. They came in and they talked, not to me, I don't speak Russian, but my father did. And everybody was quite, at least we were quite pleased, because the immediate danger of being liquidated, we thought had disappeared, the coming of the Russians. This was not completely true, because there were Polish underground troops who also killed some of my friends after the liberation by the Russians. They also killed some Jews. But there were also Poles who helped. It has to be said that there were some instances in my experiences where I was helped by Poles who knew exactly what was going on and who just wanted to do the right thing, a tremendous risk to themselves. Of course, once the Russians came, then other problems came up, because once a problem is solved, you immediately have to save another problem. You had to make contact with the world and find out what to do next. And my father being very ill, we somehow made it to Lublin. I don't think that I should go into all the details about this trip. And my father went straight to the hospital in Lublin. My aunt got a job in Lublin. And then when my father came out of the hospital, he stayed with her. And I started traveling between Lublin, Warsaw, and Łódź, or Lodz, whichever, whether it's German or Polish, in order to see what I was going to do next. And I settled in Łódź for a while. I played in the Philharmonic Orchestra in Łódź after World War II. Now, this was now the Polish Philharmonic in Łódź. And I also went to the conservatory for close to a year. In the meantime, my father became very ill again and died. In Lublin. I will say at this point that he died at least with the knowledge that he had made it, because there were times during our terrible experiences when he had a stroke, when he would actually say that he wouldn't mind actually dying at this point, but there was just no way that he could die, because what would happen if he did? Since we could not circulate ourselves. And he even tried to think about it and talk to us, what would we do with the body? Since, when you under death sentence, you cannot very well call the authorities and say, come and pick up a body, there's a dead man here. So some of the fact that he survived as long as he did, being this ill, in my opinion, was undoubtedly a very strong will, to see whether we cannot get over this, and all this walking that we did outside of Warsaw that he had to do because he could not be carried. So he died right around the time when President Roosevelt died. The two deaths just about came at the same time. And then after that, I still stayed 1 year in Poland, trying to orient myself, what I should do next. And from Poland, I went to Paris, where I had a cousin, a very fine lady by the name of Edgar Aftergood, who is living today in Israel. She sent someone since when she found out that I was the only one who survived, because she had two brothers, parents and grandparents, and they all perished. So these were very close relatives. Her father was my father's brother. She sent someone to take me out of Poland illegally, without papers. And this is another story that was very eventful, very hectic. Took about 12 days to get from the Polish border to Paris. But I made it, and I spent 2 years in Paris. And I remember these days really as very, very wonderful days, because first of all there was freedom, and then all of a sudden the world had opened up, even though right after the war there was nothing to eat in France, especially for foreigners, but it was still wonderful, and I had wonderful remembrance. I met my wife to be in Paris. She was studying at the Sorbonne. And then I got my papers to come to the United States. We all know what a wonderful country that is. And I have a new family now. As you know, and it just has grown somewhat. I survived. I'm in good health. And it's very strange even to think that a week from today, I'm going to be 60 years old. And when I think that my father, who was an old man, he died at 61. To me, at that time, since I was in my 20s, he was actually very old. And at that point, he already looked old. I think that's my story.
Very good.